Assassin's Creed is a series rife with moral ambiguity. Shay betrays the assassins to keep the world safe, Ezio kills the wrong people in Constantinople, and Eivor is, well, a Viking. Much of the lore of the series is steeped in philosophy, with the basic struggle between the Templars and assassins symbolizing the wider debate between freedom and security. Some of the characters in the lore do a great job of articulating the strengths and weaknesses of the two sides, and this gives Assassin's Creed a life that many other lores don't have, opting for a world of nuance over black and white framing. We see this across the run of the series, especially with Shay, Haytham, and Altair. Each of these characters defines what it means to be a Templar or an assassin, and monologues and codex pages by these characters are some of the highlights of the series. Of course, at the end of the day, Assassin's Creed isn't real, and while the ideas in the game are interesting, the characters are the mouthpieces of writers. Writers who live in the real world and have their ideas shaped not by cutscenes, but by real philosophers. Many philosophers and thinkers have graced the pages of history and determined the value structures for millions, even billions of people, sometimes explicitly, sometimes indirectly through culture. The writers of Assassin's Creed are no exception to this, and fortunately for us, a couple of installments in the series come full circle, not only re-articulating the ideas of great thinkers, but also reincarnating one of them into the lore. This man occupies a middleman position on the Assassin's Creed moral landscape, inspiring Ezio while himself being inspired by the assassin's worst enemy. Throughout Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood, Niccolò Machiavelli plays a vital role, not only providing support for Ezio, but also outlining the moral complexities of the whole lore and, in real life, of leadership. Hey everyone, today we're going to be looking at the real-world life of Niccolò Machiavelli and comparing it to his portrayal in Assassin's Creed 2 and Brotherhood. Before we get into it, remember to like, comment, subscribe, and follow me and IS Ronell on Instagram. Niccolò Machiavelli was born May 3rd, 1469 in Florence. His family was rich and prestigious going back over a century, but his father was comparatively poor and lived on a small estate near the city. It was here that Niccolò grew up, reading books in the study, learning Latin as well as Italian. The Italy that Machiavelli inhabited was very different from the one that exists today, with the peninsula being controlled by various city-states, each with different forms of government. By the late 1400s, Florence had become one of the most preeminent powers of the region, fighting wars with neighbors like Milan and Venice, as well as civil wars with Pisa. Niccolò lived during the Habsburg-Valois Wars, where Italy served as a battleground between its constituent kingdoms, as well as other European powers like France, Spain, and the Holy Roman Empire. Florence had been a republic since the 1100s, but this popular government was frequently taken over by dictators and oligarchs. At the time of Niccolò's birth, Florence was ruled by the Medici family, a clan of bankers that had used their power and resources to become the sole leaders of the city. However, by 1494, other European powers came to Florence, and French forces deposed the Medici, restoring the republic. This didn't last long, however, as just a month later the city came under the rule of the mad priest Girolamo Savonarola. Savonarola, unlike the previous despots in Florentine history, was not an oligarch but a clergyman who vowed to turn Florence into a city of God. Under his rule, books were burned, symbols of vanity were destroyed, and the city was turned into a theocracy. This was relatively popular for a time, but when Savonarola started a war with the rebellious city of Pisa, it caused massive food shortages in the city, and he was publicly tortured and burned at the stake. Throughout all this time, Machiavelli was growing up, receiving an education in line with the burgeoning Renaissance in Italy. He learned about Greek and Roman philosophy and history, and watched as the dome of the Santa Maria was built. He was exposed to the works of Brunelleschi, and in keeping with men of good standing, he learned about politics and economics. Learning from the Medici, Savonarola, as well as the Republican elements of Florence, Machiavelli developed a complex understanding of leadership, which would inform his later works. It's also during this time that we first see Machiavelli in Assassin's Creed, first in Venice, then later in Florence and Forli, assisting Ezio with taking down Savonarola and the Orsi. Niccolo's studies apparently served him well, as in 1498 he became the second Chancelleria of Florence, essentially in control of Florence's foreign affairs and subject territories, all without having any prior experience or apprenticeship. 4 years later, Florence fell back into its authoritarian phase with the election of Piero Soderini in the position of Gonfaloniere for life. This did not harm Machiavelli, however, as the pair became friendly, and Machiavelli's influence on the Gonfaloniere made Niccolo's job even easier. During his time as Chancelleria, Machiavelli went on many diplomatic missions to the Vatican, France, the Holy Roman Empire, and even stayed in the court of Cesare Borgia during his conquests in 1502. I talked about this in my video on Cesare Borgia, which you can watch here, but in 1502 Machiavelli witnessed what would go down in history as the Magione conspiracy. At the city of Senigallia, Cesare's mercenary generals defected and decided to try and take the lands they had conquered for Cesare for themselves. However, the separate generals were not organized or even popular enough with the local populations to really do anything. Seeing this, Cesare invited the generals back to Senigallia to reconcile. When they arrived, however, he had them all strangled. Seeing this, Machiavelli mused, one should not offend a prince and later put faith in him. The next year, Machiavelli wrote a book titled Dal modo da trattare I seduti della Valdiciana ribellati. I probably butchered that. While a minor work compared with what he would later write, Del Modo served to compare the political maneuvers of Florence and ancient Rome, specifically with how they handled rebellious territories. Ultimately, Niccolo came to the stark conclusion that a state must either win the rebels over with empty concessions or totally destroy them. Here, Machiavelli combined history, politics, and pragmatic notions of power, setting the stage for his famous works. 1503 was also the year of the fall of Cesare Borgia, where Pope Julius II was elected and Cesare was arrested. In celebration, Machiavelli wrote the poem First Decanale, where he said that Cesare was a rebel against Christ who deserved his fate. Machiavelli's relationship with Cesare was complicated, as we see in the game. He obviously admired the Borgia prince and thought he was a powerful and effective statesman, but he seemed to have had moral objections with his actions nonetheless.
Cesare has set his sights on all of Italia, and at this rate he will have it.
Is that admiration I hear in your voice?
He knows how to exercise his will. A rare virtue in the world today.
By 1505, Machiavelli's relationship with the Gonfaloniere bore fruit when Machiavelli created and organized the first Florentine militia, replacing the use of mercenaries that was commonplace at the time. This obviously worked, as by the next year Florence had reincorporated Pisa, finally regaining the rebellious city. However, his position as Chancelleria would not last. In 1512, the Italian Wars would strike the heart of Florence again, when papal armies working for the Pope took over Florence and installed an old friend, Giovanni de' Medici. Like most powerful families, the Medici had continued to survive even after they lost power. While their power in Florence waned, they ended up finding favor in other areas, as they would later do in France and, of course, in the Vatican. Giovanni had become a cardinal, and when the Papal States switched sides of the conflict, he saw a perfect opportunity to reclaim his family's city. Soderini was deposed, along with all of the city's leadership, including Machiavelli. In accordance with the brutal politics of the time, the Medici regime accused him of conspiracy against them and had him imprisoned and tortured, where he was hung by his wrists behind his back until his shoulders were dislocated. Eventually, however, he was released and sent into exile at the estate where he had grown up near the city. During this time, Machiavelli wrote the two works that he would later become famous for, The Prince and the Discourses on Livy. While neither were officially published until after his death, an early version of The Prince was published and distributed in Florence in 1513 under the title De Principatibus. Meanwhile, Giovanni de' Medici became Pope Leo X, and his cousin, Lorenzo II ruled Florence. Lorenzo would die in 1519, and his fellow Medici relative, Giulio, would take his place. With this, Machiavelli would be brought back into Florence to serve Giulio and the Pope, who were by now trying to make the city a better place. Florence had waned under Lorenzo II, so Leo and Giulio decided they needed help from some people who actually knew what they were doing. Machiavelli's first assignment was helping with a bankruptcy problem in the city of Lucca. You would think that the Medici, of all people, would be able to fix banking issues, but I guess a generation in the church will do that to a family. Anyway, Machiavelli fixed the problem and wrote a book on it, so the Medici decided to make him historian of Florence, and he began to write a history of the city. Unfortunately, Machiavelli had the problem of the truth, which the Medici didn't like very much. In order to write an accurate history of the Republic, he would have to point out the splendor of Florence's Republican history and politics, and point out that this was all undone by the Medici family, who he was currently working for. At the same time, Machiavelli wrote a discourse on the organization of the Florentine government, which also was critical of the Medici's regime. The Pope didn't like this too much, and in 1521 Machiavelli was sent to a church to reason about silence for 2 weeks. Fortunately for Machiavelli, Pope Leo X would die later that year, and Giulio had more autonomy on how he wanted the city to run. Actually living in Florence, Giulio de' Medici was more sympathetic to Machiavelli's views and allowed for some economic and political reform to return Florence to its previous splendor. This relationship with Giulio would once again pay off for Machiavelli, as in 1523 the Medici would become Pope Clement VII. Unfortunately for Florence, the Pope's new underlings who ruled, also Medicis, were very unpopular and were bad for the city and its people. On the bright side, Machiavelli was able to publish his history of Florence in 1525, which, surprisingly, didn't preclude him from rising to the position of Procutore del Mura in 1526, which essentially made him in charge of defending Florence. This coincided with the beginning of the War of the League of Cognac, and during the war, Machiavelli actually went to the papal army to see them fight the Holy Roman Empire's forces. However, it turns out that the Holy Roman Empire was better at fighting than the papacy was, and in 1527 Rome and the Vatican were sacked. After the Sabaton song, Florence was finally free from the Vatican and the Medici, and the Republic resumed once again. Finally, Machiavelli got his chance to be restored to Chancelleria, but due to his cooperation with the Medici, he was denied. With no purpose left in life, Machiavelli became ill and finally died later that year at the age of 58. Years later, his two most well-known works, the Discourses of Livy and the Prince, were published in 1531 and 32 respectively. So, now that we know about Machiavelli's life, how does the real man compare to his portrayal in Assassin's Creed? Well, we can start with his first appearance in the series in Assassin's Creed II in Venice in 1488. At this time, Machiavelli would be only 19. I don't know about you guys, but Machiavelli has always seemed like he was older than Ezio to me, but he is actually 10 years younger. As for being in Venice, there is no reason why he would or wouldn't be here historically, as at this time he was still being educated, so it's possible that he could travel. Machiavelli also helped Ezio during the reign of Savonarola in 1498. This is also accurate, as Machiavelli lived in Florence at the time and actually had commented on Savonarola, who he saw as an effective orator but lacked the ability to corral and enforce rules upon his subjects. The next year is when we see the end of Assassin's Creed II and the beginning of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. Here is when Machiavelli becomes more powerful, as he became the Chancelleria after Savonarola's fall. All through Brotherhood, Machiavelli was in his most powerful position, which makes sense since he was the head of the Italian assassins at this time. It also makes sense why he would be in Rome and familiar with Cesare Borgia, since he went on diplomatic missions fairly regularly. While it's hard to tell how much Machiavelli is actually in Rome when he's not appearing in cutscenes in the game, it does seem that he is there too much, given that he operated out of Florence rather than Rome. In the books outside of the games, Machiavelli is also shown to travel to Valencia in 1506, which still makes sense given his diplomatic travels, as well as France in 1519. This one is a bit less realistic, but still possible given that Machiavelli was in exile at the time, and it seems unlikely that the Medici would just let him go wherever he wanted, but I suppose it is possible. Without Machiavelli's attitude and ideas portrayed throughout the series, here Assassin's Creed does quite well. This is perhaps best shown in Brotherhood, especially towards the beginning of the game. When Ezio returns to the assassins after sparing Rodrigo, Machiavelli chastises him. This actually reflects something that he would write about in The Prince, where he says to destroy your enemies so they cannot hurt you in the future. In his own words, if an injury is to be done to a man, it should be so severe that the prince is not in fear of revenge. As it turns out, Machiavelli was right, as the Borgia would strike at Montegirioni. Later in the game, when Ezio comes to Rome, Machiavelli praises Cesare Borgia as a capable and effective leader, despite not liking his morals. This is accurate as well, given that Machiavelli toured with Cesare in 1502 and sung his praises, but was personally and morally opposed to him. This general idea is one that exists throughout Machiavelli's works, especially when one contrasts his two works, The Prince and Discourses on Livy. In The Prince, Machiavelli is extremely pragmatic. He advises that leaders do what is effective, not what is morally good. He suggests lying, brutality against enemies, and repression of political rivals. However, when writing about the Romans, Machiavelli makes it quite obvious that he himself supports republicanism and good morality, which fits into his actions when writing for the Medici, as well as the general idea of being an assassin in the game. Throughout his life and works, Machiavelli makes it clear that he opposes tyranny and even supports various democratic measures, such as arming the populace and a leader that answers to the people rather than the elite. Machiavelli also references another of the game's characters, Caterina Sforza, in his work The Prince. During a mission at the end of Assassin's Creed 2, Sforza's city of Forli is taken over by the Orsi brothers, and Machiavelli and Ezio help to liberate the city. Later in his life, Machiavelli would reflect on this and point out that even if a city has good defenses against outsiders, a leader is only as strong as their internal politics, as traitors can be even more ruinous than an invading army. Towards the end of Assassin's Creed Brotherhood, Machiavelli says to Ezio that he plans on writing a book about him one day. Ezio replies, "If you do, make it short." This seemingly refers to Machiavelli's most famous work, The Prince, which is relatively short and focuses on pragmatic political theory. There are various parts in The Prince where Ezio's practices seem to appear in the book, such as when Machiavelli advises princes to be both physically and strategically well-versed in warfare and combat. However, besides the more liberal-minded ideas I've already mentioned, the prince doesn't really seem to emulate Ezio all that much, so I think that this attempt at connecting history in the game isn't that great. Overall, I think Assassin's Creed does a good job portraying Machiavelli in the game. I think Cesare's portrayal is still better, but nonetheless, I think that his inclusion in the story is very important. Not only does he provide a philosophical and wise voice through the series, the fact of him being in the game is also probably the only reason that I know he exists. Assassin's Creed has been a gateway for many people of the younger generations into history, learning about important people and events, as well as showing us the lesser-known elements of history. So that's it for this video, guys. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe for more content. Let me know what you'd like to see more videos on. I was thinking of making a video about The Prince by itself outside of Machiavelli. I touched on it a little here, but didn't go into too much detail, so let me know if that's something you'd be interested in. Anyways, I hope all of you have a good day, and I will see you all next time.